Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Shuvaloy Majumdar, and I'm the Foreign Policy Director and Monk Senior Fellow for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute here in Ottawa. In the wake of weekend protests across the West, provoking historic levels of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim violence, perhaps we can open today's dialogue with a celebration of holy occasions for the Indigenous peoples of the region and our earnest wishes for peace and calm. Happy Shavuot and Eid Mubarak to all. Shalom and salam. Let me also welcome and thank you for being here for this timely conversation on Canadian interests in a realigning region. Pearson's diplomacy is an integral part of Canadian and Canada's outlook in the Middle East. Set in the Suez Crisis, linking Mediterranean and Red Sea, the end of the Western imperial rule, the founding of the State of Israel, and in the midst of the Cold War, the advent of peacekeeping won Lester Pearson a Nobel Prize for de-escalating tensions. Since then, as crises emerged, Canada over the last half century has done their part in responding to various flashpoints, as recently as responding to the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, holding Iran accountable for its human rights record at the United Nations, humanitarian assistance in Yemen, anti-piracy off the Horn of Africa, leadership in coalitions in the Sinai and across North Africa, security and economic pressures. Our panel today is about going beyond Pearson, going from reactive to isolated pressures toward a proactive, comprehensive, interest-led agenda for Canada in the wider region. And today's realities are not of a Middle East in isolation from its international context. Global disruptions of multipolar advents, including the rise of China, populism and nationalism, and of technology's benefits and risks, bring issues of war and peace much, much closer to home. So today's conversation, over the next hour and a half, we want to welcome you to a dialogue that will include three parts. First, a conversation with an extraordinary group of very talented individuals who have accomplished remarkable things in their own career to help us understand the realities of the current and contemporary Middle East, and to lend their insights and expertise as to what Canada's interest could be in it. That'll be an opening conversation for about 30 minutes. The next 30 minutes will be focused on a dialogue between panelists, having an exchange of views from as far north as the border with Turkey to as far south as the Horn of Africa, west in the Mediterranean, and east, perhaps even as far as Afghanistan, but certainly including Iran. And finally, the remaining third will be to open up a dialogue to you, our wonderful audience, who've taken the time to participate, to listen, and hopefully to engage. So we encourage you to propose your questions in the chat group. My colleagues and I will vet them as best as we can to make sure we cover the widest range of voices and views and put your compelling questions to the audience. Before we get started, because of Shavuot, we've been able to welcome a daughter of Canada through a virtual recording. Michal Kotler-Wunsch, Montreal born and raised, lawyer of acclaim in her own right, brings greetings from Israel and wanted to provide a couple of perspectives that I think are essential in helping shape the conversation that we're having today, a timely conversation which we will begin today in Jerusalem. So maybe at this point I can ask my colleagues to air her first intervention to kick this discussion off. Without any further ado, Michal Kotler-Wunsch.
I apologize that I'm not there. Hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity of addressing you on this very timely and important topic. I apologize that I'm not there with you today. It is actually the holiday of Pentecost. I wish you a very interesting panel with a very important group of speakers that you have there today, and I look forward to other future opportunities to engage in person. I wanted to give a bit of a different perspective onto the issue at hand today and really use the last 48 hours of what Israel and Israelis have been living through, basically an all-out war in which Hamas, a genocidal terror organization recognized as such by Canada, has elected to violate international law, to violate the rules-based order, which I believe Canada has such an incredible ability and perhaps even responsibility to ensure is upheld, promoted, and protected. And when we talk about the violation of that rules-based order, of international law, foundational principles, it is about Hamas not only targeting all Israeli civilians, and I can share with you that last night as we ran to the shelter, 70% of Israel's civilians were under fire. 70% of Israel's civilians had rockets launched at them with the intention, with the aim to kill. The fact that Iron Dome intercepts the majority of those rockets should not bear any consequence as far as our holding Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, to account for the violation of international law. But there is another compounded, double violation of international law, because Hamas, that same genocidal terror organization, is electing to launch rockets from very densely populated areas in the Gaza Strip, and in that way subjecting their own citizens and violating the rights and international law towards their own Palestinian citizens, and in fact using them as human shields, again in violation, gross violation of foundational principles of international law. And so by not holding to account what we see of as a perverted reality, in fact, where Hamas on one hand claims to speak for international law, and those that justify this standing violation of international law by Hamas speak to international law principles, when that is not addressed by countries such as Canada, by the international community, by trustees of international law and human rights. In fact, what that does is empower a continued culture of impunity towards the gravest violators of the rules-based order of which Canada is so committed to. And it, in fact, undermines the ability, the responsibility of all trustees of international law, all trustees of human rights, Canada included, to protect, promote, and ensure the rights of those most needing and deserving of that protection. I hope that we have future opportunities to engage, and I hope that you have a very productive discussion today.
Thank you very much, Michal, for your commentary. I know that you will be able to watch the show after Shavuot, so your powerful remarks on the international rules-based system, the rule of law as being central, is certainly a very helpful thing. We have a diversity of views among our panelists today, and we are engaging in a rich dialogue toward understanding the realities of the Middle East region. And so I think it's perhaps timely to open this discussion with Nikolai Mladenov. Nikki had led the UN mission in Jerusalem for the last 6 years, and prior to that was leading the UN mission in Iraq. He's a former foreign minister of Bulgaria, having listed Hezbollah as among the first nations in Europe for their terrorism as a terrorist entity. Nikolai, let me kick off this discussion today by asking you a very simple question set amidst the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the violence by Hamas, the pressures of Iran, and a region that seems inflamed yet once again. What's going on?
Thank you, Shuv. Thank you for this very, very timely opportunity. In fact, at least 2 of the past 6 years that I was based in Jerusalem, I worked almost 100% of my time to prevent what happened just now. And on at least 3 occasions, we were able to prevent it. But let me clarify a little bit, as you said, what's going on. First, this is entirely the responsibility of Hamas. Hamas chose to escalate a conflict that they should not have been involved in. This is the tensions that were rising in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, at the Temple Mount, at the Al-Aqsa holy sites in the Old City. Hamas started by launching rockets first at Jerusalem, which is something that hadn't happened in a very, very long time, and then escalating to over 2,000 rockets fired at Israeli civilian sites around the country. Israel's operation is a response entirely to that escalation. Now, what we need to do now is, as quickly as possible, find a way out of this current escalation, because it has cost the lives of both Israelis and Palestinians, civilians, And it is risking enlarging the conflict into a broader region. De-escalating right now is extremely important, and making sure that Hamas's militant capabilities in Gaza no longer pose a threat to Israeli civilians living across the border. Now, whether that will happen today or in the next coming days, it's still unclear, because at least the information that I have observing this from the outside for a couple of months now is that there's very limited opportunities for mediation right now. But de-escalating is extremely important. Nevertheless, the issues in Jerusalem also have to be addressed. There are a lot of tensions that have been building, particularly in East Jerusalem over the last years and over the last months, that have created a very tense situation in the old city. But this is no reason for Hamas to be waving their flag around the protests in Jerusalem or trying to become the leader of the Palestinian cause. Any such development will be extremely detrimental to the Palestinians. What they need to do politically is really to get back to what was the agenda that we were all hoping to work towards. And that is to have elections among the Palestinian people that choose a leadership that is representative of everyone, that includes representation from various factions, various people, various political entities, and a leadership that is able to re-engage with Israel in a meaningful way, on reviving the peace process in a way that it can actually deliver both statehood to Palestinians and peace to Israel. Unfortunately, every day this situation continues to unfold, we get further and further away from that goal, and we were likely to see much more radicalization on the ground, much more intensification of violence, and something that we will have to live for a very long period of time with. That is why I'm very concerned by what we're seeing on the ground, and I hope that soon enough there'll be opportunities for mediation and for de-escalation.
Oh, thank you very much, and greatly appreciate your perspectives. Now, from your time in the issues that are affecting the contemporary headlines of today, you also have a rich set of experience from the perspective of what's happening in Iraq and in the wider Gulf. I know it's difficult to extract from the headlines of the moment, which are driving so much of the news cycles, but we're trying to have a thoughtful discussion on the wider issues of the Middle East. So from your perspective, Nikolai, what do you think this conflict portends when set into the realities of the Levant and the Gulf regions?
Well, look, the region has been changing for quite some time, and particularly over the last couple of years, the major dramatic shifts that have happened are the Abraham Accords that were signed, peace between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Now, that shift reflects a broader tendency in the region, and that tendency includes two factors. One is religious radicalization, and the other factor is the increasing importance of the forces of moderation that need to come together and prevent further radicalization on the ground. What I've seen in Iraq with my own eyes when Mosul fell and the beginnings of ISIS is that if you leave a territory of people marginalized for a long enough period of time, if they have no services, if they have no access to development, if they feel segregated, if they feel isolated, social structures in these regions will start to collapse. And as they collapse, people will become prey to radical groups that have the influence and the financing and the ideology coming from the outside. And such radical groups, ISIS is one of those, will very quickly and very violently take over and be able to control land for a long period of time. Now, what we see, to just make a very quick and perhaps inappropriate parallel, what we've seen in Gaza is that Hamas's control there is being absolutely total for more than a decade. Thankfully, the situation in Iraq and in parts of Syria was quickly resolved by the coalition, but people there still need to see development opportunities and strengthening the voices of moderation. And what I'm particularly excited about the future is that as we move forward to consolidating the Abraham Accords, that provides an opportunity exactly for such such initiatives, strengthening economic cooperation, strengthening educational cooperation, strengthening the understanding of cultures and other religions, and certainly providing development to the entire region. The region is not beyond a risk of a revival of ISIS and radical Islamists, particularly in eastern Syria, but also elsewhere. And it is extremely important for the international community, Canada included, the European Union, the Americans, everyone else, to really join hands and come together with a strong strategy for protecting the region from such developments. And that strategy should, and I sort of move a little bit to the topic of this discussion, should also include the Red Sea area, because the Red Sea area is now intimately linked to the Middle East economically and socially, and in all kinds of ways. In fact, much more than in the past. We have pretty similar risks emerging in parts of the Horn of Africa. We have at least two countries that are undergoing very complicated transition processes, Sudan and Ethiopia. And we have a dramatically changing demographic. Within the next 15 years, the population of the Horn of Africa will rise by close to 40%. And people there do need to see opportunities for development. And really, I think that should be very much the focus of a broader discussion in the West on how we promote not just development, but social inclusion, and how we also strengthen institutions in these countries to prevent their collapse down the road.
And thank you very much for your opening comments, Nikki. I'm going to now turn to Miriam Memar-Sadeghi, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, leading proponent for human rights, for a bit of a perspective on what Nikolai just left off on, which was the conflicts of the Horn of Africa, the issues a bit further east from the Mediterranean. From your perspective, Miriam, when you think about Iran's role in the region, what are some of the major takeaways that you have for the major issues that they're contributing to or instigating in the conflicts today?
Thank you so much, Shuv. Thanks to all the fellow panelists, and of course to MLI for this wonderful opportunity. I think that, you know, it's possible to look at all the issues that we have been discussing already so far from the perspective of how much power does the Islamic Republic wield from Tehran, and how is it that this imperial regime, imperial mafia state really exerts its influence through proxy forces throughout the region. But maybe I'll take a step back, if that's okay, and have a wider lens first about the long-term strategic interests of Canada in the region, and in general, what will a more peaceful, prosperous, free, stable Middle East look like? I think a lot of that starts from people living in Canadian society and in other free countries having more of a understanding, a discourse, an exchange, knowledge, particularly in the academic world, the policymaking community, the think tank world, that is rooted in facts about the Middle East. And I think we assume that that is more easily possible than I think it is, particularly because in our social media age, there is a lot of polarization. There's a lot of disinformation operations that are, not all of them, but a lot of the disinformation about these countries in the region is the work or the product of some of these regimes, and Iran in particular is very good at it. There's a lot of infiltration within the academic community about Islamists in particular. There's a lot of empathy and naivete about what they're about, what their history is, what their ideology is about. And so having a truthful discourse, a real understanding about what's happening in the Middle East region is going to be critical to policymaking and understanding that actually helps the people of that region to have a better life, and then in turn for the world at large to be more secure and peaceful. So I would say that good foreign policy making really starts at home in Canada, and a better understanding of how we can protect are discourses in the universities and in high schools, how we can have conversations about policy in the Middle East that are not going through these very bifurcated, very separated echo chambers on social media, and to really come together with fact-based, empirical understanding of who is who on the ground, what are they after, how are they being affected, how are people, ordinary people, being affected by different kinds of political actors on the ground, and who are our real allies and who are our foes. And I think it's really imperative that as part of a strategic long-term view on policymaking, there's a real moral clarity on who are Canada and the free world's true allies, and who are the foes that need to be defeated. In 5, 10, 15 years, if the Middle East is a more secure, prosperous, free place, it's because Islamists have less power and influence. It's because Hamas is not able to do what it's doing. And I do see Hamas as a proxy force of the Islamic Republic, just as I do Houthis in Yemen or various militias in Iraq, Lebanese Hezbollah. Just imagine what this region will look like, feel like, be for somebody, a girl who's 7 or 8 years old right now, if none of those actors exist, and instead of them, there are different democratic political parties competing for a vision of what's best for their country. Imagine if the competitions within the region are among just different visions for what a democratic, open society looks like, rather than Democrats, open society, liberal, humanist people on one side and Islamists on the other. That would be a real sea change, and it's really the fight that's worth having for the region, because it all comes back to us eventually. So even from cold, hard, realist perspective, even if we don't care at all about the people there and what their future is about, we have to care about the free world, and the free world can't be secure unless people in the region are able to breathe, are able to be free and have dignified lives, and able to create their own future. It's not going to happen overnight, but to at least have a chance of creating their own future. So the current policy from the United States, Canada, Europe towards the Islamic Republic is not really in keeping with creating that kind of future, because unfortunately it's an appeasement posture towards the Islamic Republic. And it's no accident that you see Hamas emboldened now to do this kind of fighting. It's because of the turn again toward basically sitting down and talking with the Islamic Republic in Vienna in a way where they determine what the agenda is, and are engaged basically in a pretty simple game of extortion. Give us this money so that we don't do this. Give us this money so that we return, a few of these hostages. Give us this money so that we enrich uranium just a little bit less than we are. And with that, that's not long-term strategic foreign policy. I want to agree with my colleague who has already mentioned the importance of civic education, civic bonds, and this is the kind of thing that, and development, human development, this is the thing that's always a little hard to sell, but is essential. And of course, the real development in the Middle East happens through free, open markets in which trust and merit-based jobs are possible. And the Abraham Accords are very hopeful and huge, really, sign of what kinds of possibilities exist for the people of the Middle East if, instead of animosity and distrust and cynicism, we have humanist bonds, innovation, a focus on business and prosperity, and allowing people to know each other as people rather than as groupings, as identities that have been at war with each other and misunderstanding. So I'll leave it there. And of course, there's lots of themes here I can come back to if you would like.
No, and I appreciate your views, Miriam, on a range of things, particularly in in trying to understand the importance of the coalition of values with the region's good actors along one side, trying to promote modernity, and the region's bad actors that may have more of a medieval mindset. However, I'm going to turn to Jonathan now. The region itself is certainly not necessarily as black and white as that when it comes to the construction of statecraft and foreign policy. When you think about the pressures that the region is facing more internationally, Jonathan Fulton is a leading scholar in the world today. He is in Abu Dhabi. He is at Sheikh Zayed University and is one of the most important, I think, academics, researchers, and commentators about how the region, the Gulf, is being impacted by its more international position, particularly as affected by the rise of China. So Jonathan, stepping back into the wider perspective, the discussion that we're having today on Canadian interests in the Middle East and Red Sea regions, I'd be curious for your perspective. You spent a long time in Abu Dhabi researching and understanding these issues. What is your advice on how to navigate these flashpoint issues that Nikolai and Miriam have touched upon from the perspective of a longer term engagement for Canada in the region?
Well, thanks, Shu. That's a generous introduction. I mean, I guess the first advice I would give is to try to have a little more empathy when looking at the region, because I think what we've heard so far is a very one-sided view of what's been happening in the region over the past little while. Certainly from the ground here, it doesn't look like everything is Hamas's fault and Israel bears no complicity in all of this. I think if we look at everything that the Netanyahu government's been doing for years, we'd see that he really seems to be using, anyway, it's not my specialty. I'm just kind of disappointed with the tone when I thought we were talking about geopolitical pressures in the region and not this politicized approach. So yeah, China, I guess that's my thing. China in the region, like you said, I've been here a long time. I came to Abu Dhabi in 2006. Before that, I spent most of my 20s in Asia. So I came here as somebody who's been focusing, I arrived in the Middle East as somebody who focused primarily on East Asian international relations. And I moved here and I could see that China and a lot of other Asian countries, extra-regional powers, were playing a much bigger role in regional policy than I think most people tended to think. We tend to look at the Middle East as a Western-penetrated or Western-dominated region. And I think that misses a lot of the more interesting geopolitical stories that are happening here. China, you look at it, most folks think of China in the Middle East as primarily an economic actor, and there's a lot of reasons for this. Just looking at the GCC, for example, which is what I typically focus on in my research, China GCC trade was valued at just under $10 billion in 2000, and last year was over 180 billion. So obviously it's a very important economic actor, and that's not just in the Gulf. It's a major economic actor, across the whole of the Middle East. China's top 5 export destination for 10 Middle Eastern countries. It's a top 3 import partner for every Middle East country. It's the top extra regional source of foreign direct investment. It's a huge contracting and investment presence. And for all of these reasons, we tend to think of China as primarily economics first. But I think the thing we have to consider is that, trade, investment, contracting, this isn't just politically neutral stuff. There are political values that are transferred. And in the region, the one thing that is glaring for everybody is that there is an overwhelming perception that the US is on its way out. And I don't think that's a perception. Every American presidential candidate, every member of Senate, Congress, whatever, is constantly talking about how the US has to get out of the Middle East or play a reduced role here. And what that does is that shapes the policy options of American rivals like Iran. It leads to a more aggressive foreign policy. It shapes the foreign policy options of regional actors that have deep defense cooperation agreements or facilities access agreements with the US, when they have to worry about that commitment, then they start to hedge their bets and they start reaching out to Russia and India and Japan and the EU and the UK and China. And of course, it changes the perceptions of extra-regional powers too that have a lot of interests, citizens, and assets in the region, and start to realize that, if the US isn't going to maintain this umbrella indefinitely, then maybe they will have to start making provisions for the security of those assets, citizens, and interests. So, I think what we often see, it's often reduced to this narrative that we get in Beijing and Washington of great power competition, that the only two actors are the US and China. From the ground in the region, nobody here really likes that binary. You see a lot of Gulf countries, as I said, are hedging their bets. They're reaching out to a lot of other countries outside the region. They're becoming much more assertive in their own foreign policies. So it is a pretty fluid dynamic for somebody who looks at foreign policy issues here. I think what we're seeing is obviously, just as the Indo-Pacific is becoming a bigger way we frame foreign policy challenges or opportunities, one thing that I don't see very often is how the Middle East, in particular the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, are key subregions of the Indo-Pacific and the northwest part of it, especially given their importance in global energy markets and in global shipping and any number of trade issues. China certainly has been building an infrastructure that acknowledges that. They've got this rather clunkily named initiative, the Two Wings, Two Wheels Industrial Park and Port Interconnectivity approach, which links ports and industrial parks from here in Abu Dhabi to Duqm and Oman to Jazan in Saudi to their planned Navy supply base in Djibouti to port industrial projects in Egypt. And all this it builds business clusters and supply chains from the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. So obviously, it's a pretty important region in the Indo-Pacific. And I think for Canada, it's not necessarily in our direct interest to play a larger role here. But there are countries that we consider pretty important partners or allies that do have direct interests. And I think we're going to have to start working more closely with them to come up with some kind of integrated approach, some way that we can support each other, not necessarily in building a deeper or stronger presence, but in supporting each other politically in things that matter to us, and competing in a healthy way with countries in the region that we think that there's a reason to push back. I'll stop here in a second. I just point out that China, which is a country that, of course, has tremendous human rights abuses and problems, is chairing the United Nations Security Council right now. And, for folks in Washington that want to use human rights to bash China, rightfully so, China does deserve to get poked for things that it's doing or to be challenged or to be confronted. It makes it a lot harder to have any moral high ground when the U.S. government is using the UNSC to stifle debate or votes on what's happening in Jerusalem right now and supporting Israel without any kind of discussion about what that means and how it looks from the ground in the Middle East. Because for folks here that will look at China or look at the U.S. as great powers that have an interest in the region right now, I don't know that either one that looks especially good. But, the U.S. doesn't seem to really be interested to keep that high ground. Thanks.
No, much appreciated, Jonathan. And certainly, you've created a really clear picture as to how China's role in the region is becoming increasingly more influential in how Western powers engage, and certainly are shifting the paradigms of what we have seen in a whole range of issues of conflict and peace and security that are informing the region moving forward. Let me ask you a second question, if it's okay. I was curious, the advent of these Abraham Accords, how do you see that as an interplay between China and the West in the region? Do you think that the Abraham Accords are creating an opportunity for countries on either side of the Mediterranean to interact in different and novel ways? Do you think that China sees the Abraham Accords as a threat or an opportunity? I'd be very curious to know what your perspectives are.
Right. Well, I mean, right now we'll have to wait and see what the Abraham Accords look like in the short term. But I think, I wrote something for the Atlantic Council where I'm a non-resident fellow. I think I published it back in March or February. A lot of the narrative after the normalization between the UAE and Israel and Bahrain and Israel seemed to indicate that this was, first and foremost, a diplomatic triumph of the U.S. and as a result, a loss for China, as if this is a zero-sum region. I don't think that's the case. I think that when you look at and this is just speculation, but I imagine that decision makers in the UAE or in Israel, when they were looking at this process of normalization, I think they were both responding to pressures at the regional level. Obviously, some of my co-panelists have already hit on Hamas and as a threat that Israel and the GCC countries face, or not equally, of course, Hezbollah, Iranian proxies, and Iran itself, and the role of Turkey in trying to reshape maybe how the Sunni leadership in the region is taking shape. So I think Israel and the UAE were probably looking at a set of shared threats primarily, and looking at shared opportunities, whether they're economic or developmental or just in shoring up a pretty unstable region. What that means for China, I think, well, I don't think it's a zero-sum situation. I don't think China looks at it and thinks, these guys are buddies now, that's good for the US. China's been working very closely with both the UAE and Israel in COVID, in vaccination programs and AI, and all sorts of digital technologies. China has a comprehensive strategic partnership with the UAE. It has very deep relations with Israel. And I imagine, and again, this is speculation because nobody in Beijing is talking to me about this, from Zhongnanhai at least. I think if I were a Chinese state-owned enterprise or a Chinese government official, I think anything that creates any kind of stability in the region is a win for everyone concerned. If it creates a better trading environment, if there's opportunities to piggyback on these relationships, I think it's probably good for everybody involved, not just China and the US, but any extra regional country that has deep interests here.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. I think you've said it perfectly for a discussion with Elena Delocher, who has done incredible work in publishing about the geopolitics of the Horn of Africa, the Gulf. She's a very well-regarded and well-known expert on Yemen. And so we brought her on to discuss the Gulf and the Red Sea region itself, and what she's been able to discover and find in the politics of the region, and how security issues are being affected not just by China, but by regional actors. I'm hoping that, Elena, would you be in a position to share with us some of your thoughts on the realities of what the Gulf and the Red Sea region look like, and the interlinking issues that are happening across that particular body of water?
Yes, good morning. Hi, everyone from DC. So I've been brought on to talk about the Gulf and Red Sea. And just to be clear, I come at this from very much the Gulf perspective. So we've heard lots of different perspectives on this particular call. We've jumped around from a couple of different topics, and the topic that I know best is the Red Sea, and specifically from the Gulf perspective. So I'm just going to comment on that. And I started to really focus on this issue because when I was living in the UAE, what you find when you live there is that there is an entire community of people from East Africa living in the UAE, and there isn't a real sense of divide between, we think of Middle East and Africa and Asia as these separate things. And when you're in the Middle East or Africa or Asia, they sort of combine in a way that they don't have those sort of lines that we have between, different regions. Traders don't see themselves as, African doing business with the Middle East. It's just business that they've always done. And so I think that I started to kind of understand the story of Gulf relationships with Asia and with Africa when I was living there. And then when I came to DC, I was invited to a conference in Ethiopia a few years ago, pre-COVID. And when I was there were a lot of conversations about what was going on the, western side of the Red Sea in terms of, the scramble for footholds, basically, that not only Ethiopians, but also other East Africans were saying, we've got China here and Turkey here and the UAE and Qatar. And, some of those things are good and some of those things are problematic. And we're talking about it. And so I suddenly realized that, these issues are just starting to cross-populate more and more and more, especially as a lot of emerging markets are actually really starting to emerge. And so that's sort of how I came at this issue. But the root of my perspective is always from the Gulf. So I'm not an Africa expert, for example. But what I think is really important is to understand that on the Africa side of the Red Sea, there is this real growth story. Now, of course, COVID is going to make that more difficult. It's hit everybody's economies. But if we just set that aside for a minute, pre-COVID, there's this story of real economic opportunity, the rise of Africa, that kind of thing. But there's a need for infrastructure in order to make that possible. So the East African states in particular have these massive growth rates. If you look at a top 10 list of the highest GDP growth in the world, several of the Horn of Africa states or East Africa states are in that list, highest GDP growth rates in the world. In addition, there's these massive populations, 100+ million people in Ethiopia, 100 million in Egypt. Somalia has 15 million. So if you add up the populations, these are massive consumer markets and also potentially massive economies that could be exporting. But in order to do that, you need infrastructure, ports, roads, et cetera, so that you can get stuff either from the sea into the markets or from the markets out into the sea. And China, Turkey, the UAE are all willing to invest that kind of infrastructure funding. And so in addition to having that sort of economic story where there's folks investing infrastructure money so that these markets can kind of come to market, you also have stories on the other side of the Red Sea and Saudi Arabia. You have this story of, Mohammed bin Salman wanting to create a tourist market. And so all of a sudden there's all this economic focus on the Red Sea. But it's not just an economic focus. There's also a security sort of lens to the whole thing. So if we think about, for example, just to merge these two issues, if you think about the Ever Given recently, right, that was stuck in the Suez Canal, this is both economic and security. It's economic because all these boats had to turn around and go a longer way and it cost them more money. So it's an economic story, but it's also about the choke points and the vulnerability of the choke points. In this case, the Suez Canal, but there's also a choke point in the south, the Bab el-Mandeb. And so in the Red Sea, security issues are major. We all know about piracy, but there's also terrorism in several of the Red Sea countries. There's war and conflict. We've heard about Tigray in Ethiopia recently. There's island territorialism, fights over islands. The internet cables run under the sea. There's illicit activity of all kinds. And then there's also migration, economic migration. So there's all kinds of issues sort of happening at once in this one little strip of sea. And I think something really critical to keep in mind is we think of seas oftentimes as dividing lines. That's not true in this particular area. For example, East Africans found it easier to cross the Red Sea to places like Yemen or Saudi Arabia than to cross the desert to go to, say, West Africa, right? So you've had these trading networks across the sea for centuries, and those still exist. And so those relationships, I think we think of Africa, Middle East, Asia, but for the folks that live in these regions, it's much more cohesive. There aren't these sort of dividing lines. And of course, there's all sorts of political fragility in this area. And I'll end on this sort of note that you've got this massive economic story. You've got a bunch of security risks. Everybody's sending their military. Djibouti has so many bases, and everyone's trying to open a port and that kind of thing. So there's a real scramble for the Red Sea. everyone's sort of descending upon the area, but it's also a really politically fragile place. Of course, we've heard about Ethiopia, we know about Yemen, we know about Somalia. I mean, these are very, very fragile environments. And so this is an area that everyone should be watching. We've got to be really careful that we don't think of, and this is for both the US, my country, but also Canada, that we don't think of these dividing lines down the Red Sea. You've got Africa and you've got the Middle East, and these are separate things that never interact. In fact, they're interacting more and more and more. And so this is really a place that we should start focusing our minds. And what's really tricky about it is it's a whole lot of things at once. You can't possibly be a China, Russia, Turkey, Gulf, Africa, terrorism, piracy expert all at once. So we really need a whole bunch of different experts to kind of look at this area, which is why I'm so excited to be on this call with Jonathan Fulton and some others who have these real specialties that collectively connect to help us understand the Red Sea.
Well, thank you for that incredibly thoughtful intervention, but also let me thank you for your incredibly important paper, which I want to encourage our viewers to go and download from the Washington Institute. Elena has described the realities of the Red Sea region in great detail, and I think it's an essential discussion point. So let me pick up on that a little bit with you, Elena, because I think this is the crux of the issue about understanding the realities of the region. Much is transforming economically. The security threat vectors are growing more asymmetric, and the West appears to be divided, not just in its own outlook. Different capitals have different views about the different conflicts of the region, but also in our own ability to create policy and outcomes that are to the prosperity and stability of both the people of the region and of our environment in the Western strategic environment. So how would you recommend to Western policymakers to think differently about the construct of the region? Would you think about incorporating the Red Sea into how military planners and diplomatic planners and development planners think about the Middle East? Would you want to expand out a more African perspective into this region? Because you're right, that seam that you described so eloquently is really limiting our ability to address the next 15, 20, 30 years. Which is principally what our conversation here today is about.
Yeah, so I think every country has to figure it out for themselves. I say that not as a cop-out answer, but because various bureaucratic structures, I don't know the Canadian bureaucratic structure well enough to answer more specifically. But in the US, for example, you might think about doing something like a special envoy. But the problem with doing a special envoy is that special envoys are oftentimes better suited for like a very discrete, specific issue that they're going to solve, as opposed to for a region which includes not only 9 literal states, coastal states, but if you include countries like Ethiopia, if you include countries that are involved in the Red Sea, you would add another 9 or so. I mean, in my paper, I talk about 18 different countries, and something like a dozen different security issues, and then there's the economic story. So you also need an economist. And so in order to understand the Red Sea as a thing in and of itself, you would need like 20 different experts. And so that can't really be one person. And so that idea, I don't call for in my paper. But then I suggest maybe there should be someone, in the bureaucracy, and this could be true in Canada as well, who is responsible for the Red Sea, right? And then they have a staff, or they draw from different parts of the government. So you draw on a China expert, who may have a different job for most of the time, but their expertise can be, utilized to understand this region better. So it could be like an interagency or a committee, something like that. The other things that you can do is have, in our system in the US, we have assistant secretaries. So the highest diplomats for the Middle East and Africa, you could have them do a joint tour, have them go to each other's regions across the seam so that they start to understand each other's issues and can work better together. I mean, there's no getting around the fact that there will always be a seam. So the other thing you can do is think about moving the seam, but, and that may be a good idea, but moving the seam will just create a seam somewhere else, right? So you still have to solve the problem of the seam somewhere. Of course, it's better to have the seams in the best place possible. And one of the issues in this particular region is that East Africa tends to just have deeper historical relationships with the Gulf than with, say, West Africa. So we think of Africa as this one whole thing. But again, it's been easier to get across the Red Sea than necessarily the desert. And so some folks call for like East Africa to be part of the same group of people that study the Gulf should also study East Africa or the Horn of Africa. But then others say, yeah, but it is still part of Africa. So trying to kind of figure out where the seam should be is a question. I think that no matter where it ends up, you still have to figure out how to work across it. And so those policies, those bureaucratic things need to be put in place. Other things you could do is add like a tag to cables for Red Sea, so anyone studying the Red Sea, whether it's the China perspective, the Turkey perspective, the whatever, they would get all the cables that are related to some topic like that. So these are the sorts of very bureaucratic, tactical sort of things that various countries could put in place to make sure that they're capturing these ideas.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Elena. Like, those are very practical tools that don't just affect, I think, the United States, but many Western governments and how they could choose to cooperate and come to a common understanding of this region. I'm going to move now to Dr. Sebastian Sons, who is a real scholar on the economic and development challenges of the region, and is at Carpo, but he brings a really unique and novel perspective, I think, to our dialogue today from Europe, especially where he is now. And in Germany. And so when you're listening to all of the interventions we've heard today so far, beginning with the kind of visceral challenges we're seeing between Israel and the Palestinian territories, we looked at the strategic challenge of Iran, have drifted into the geopolitics of the Gulf region and China, and now trying to define the region of the Middle East in an area that is as complex as the Red Sea. When you take a step back, Sebastian, and think about the long-term economic and development challenges at play, what do you think of as recommendations for Germany, for Canada, for the West as they consider this realigning and transforming region?
Yeah, thank you very much, Shu, for this nice introduction, and thank you very much for being part of this very great panel so far. So I'm based in Berlin at the moment, and of course Europe and specifically Germany has a different perspective on the region than maybe other parts of the world. We've heard about China, we've heard also about the US. For Germany, of course, the main interest is security, stability when it comes to migration, when it comes to rising social and economic uncertainties in times of COVID-19, when it comes to climate change. And in this regard, Germany is trying to seek for fields of cooperation in which Germany could engage more with the region, specifically with the Arab Gulf states that have emerged as the most relevant regional actors in recent years from an Arab perspective. And in this regard, today I would like to focus a little bit on the perspective of development assistance and humanitarian aid that offer interesting potential for joint cooperation between Europe and the Gulf, which has been widely ignored in political and public discussions yet. And it has also been widely ignored that, of course, the Gulf states, specifically Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait, have emerged as relevant providers of development assistance across the globe since the 1970s. And of course, development cooperation has become a relevant tool of all the Gulf states to preserve power, to preserve economic interests, legitimacy, as well to get access to markets and trade routes. But we are also in a period in which development cooperation in all Gulf states is undergoing a fundamental transformation. And this is due to radical shifts in their national socioeconomic development based on rising regional destabilization, long-term socioeconomic challenges, and of course, the double shock caused by the sharp decline in oil prices and the outbreak of COVID-19 last year. And this transformation also affects all Gulf states' development cooperation. This bears challenges, but also brings new potential for cooperation with Europe. For instance, I want to give some quite pragmatic examples from my experience when I worked for 2 years for the German Development Cooperation Agency, GIZ, in order to enhance specifically German Gulf states cooperation in terms of development cooperation. And what we have witnessed over the last couple of years is there is a trend in Gulf donor or development assistance to provide more technical cooperation rather than only financial assistance. And this is also due to the lack of financial resources all the Gulf states are going through at the moment. They need to focus more on specific areas such as education and vocational training. And of course, this offers also plenty of opportunities for cooperation on a bilateral or even on a trilateral and a triangular level. And in order to present themselves as reliable international partners, all Gulf states seek to better coordinate with international and multilateral institutions. For instance, they have participating status in the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD DAC. And this is a clear indicator for their serious commitment to improve transparency on data and also to counterbalance specific international criticism against their mechanisms and modules of providing aid, providing assistance, also maybe to spreading ideological definitions and understandings all across the globe. And I think in this regard, we also see a very interesting shift towards more multilateralism. And interestingly, even during the blockade against Qatar, joint measures in Gulf Development Cooperation continued and were facilitated through this Arab Coordination Group, in which all bilateral Gulf development agencies, as well as the multilateral institutions, are members. And also, of course, Qatar is a member and was a member, and cooperation and exchange went on even during the blockade. And this example explains how many potential development cooperation offers even in times of high polarization. And against this backdrop, cooperation with Gulf development actors could be enhanced in 3 fields to foster regional stabilization integration. I only can provide a couple of examples. So the first one would be improved cooperation in entrepreneurship. In times of COVID-19, job creation is crucial all across the region. It does not matter if it's an African country, if it's an Arab country or an Asian country. And by developing regional entrepreneurship, a young generation could be empowered to establish its own business models or startups in sectors such as digital services, ecological tourism, or alternative energy. And that could also bring good opportunities for Canada, for Germany, for other countries to step in and to join forces in this regard. Second, improve cooperation in energy diversification and in environmental issues. Climate change and sustainability have become integral parts of the discussion, also in the Gulf, and offer great potential for closer cooperation. The times of the oil wealth are over. So therefore, there is a transformation going on. There's energy diversification going on. And there is a broader understanding that alternative energy, climate change are real issues everybody has to deal with. And specifically here, I can see potential for more enhanced cooperation in a development from a development perspective. And last but not least, improved trilateral cooperation. Together with multilateral donor organizations such as the Islamic Development Bank, good chances for trilateral cooperation exist, such as in sectors as education, vocational training, or the health sector, and also to look more into partnerships that have not been developed that much so far. So look, for instance, also in partnerships that can take place on a South-South level, that can bring together maybe also cooperation agencies from Latin America with agencies from the region, also to take into consideration the Abraham Accords and what could play out in this regard when it comes to development cooperation and trilateral and triangular cooperation between Israel, between Europe, between the UAE, for instance. But of course, I gave a rather positive evaluation, but risks will remain. At the beginning, there is very little donor coordination, even among Western or traditional donors, also among the Gulf states and between both groups. So this is a very big obstacle. We oftentimes do not really know what the others are doing. We often do not really know what our institution is sometimes doing in a different part of the world, which also brings some problems with us. And due to the fact that the Gulf states' definition of social contracts often differs from the European or the German definition when it comes to political participation or human rights, every chance for cooperation also bears risks. Therefore, principles such as fairness, transparency, and accountability need to be carefully assessed before considering cooperation with Arab Gulf states. I will leave it at that point, and back to you, Shuv.
Thank you, Sebastian. I think you've done an incredible job. Thank you for your intervention, because what you've done is build from the ashes of conflict a potential plan for how to engage in the region's prosperity as stability arrives. Let me ask you this. Many people in the West have a view of the Middle East in that it is perpetually mired in conflict, and that many of the opportunities that you're describing on anything ranging from energy transformation to infrastructure to social development are inaccessible because of how far away it seems. From your perspective and your personal experience in the region, how should we think about that pull between development and the opportunities it affords, the instruments you've described, and the pressures of conflict that often dominate so many of the headlines?
I think that's a very relevant question. And first of all, in the region, even conflict parties, warring parties such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, they are partly suffering from the same challenges, such as the youth bulge, rising unemployment, environmental issues, water scarcity, etc. So in this regard, there is an understanding among the people, and we at Carpo, we organized different events to bring people together from the Gulf, from Iraq, from Yemen, from Iran, to sit at one table and to discuss specifically those joint obstacles and challenges. And I think there is a lot of potential, and there's also a lot of understanding, specifically among a younger generation that wants to overcome this polarized and this polarized era of demonization, I would call it this way, and just focus on what is really needed. It's needed to create jobs. It's needed to create a future perspective for families and also for the region as a whole. And my understanding is, and maybe this could also play out in the next couple of months and years, that the region is in flux, and that a new generation is trying to understand and trying to adapt to a new situation that is dominated by overarching challenges that cannot be solved by weapons, such as COVID-19 and others. And we see, at least from my perspective, we see kind of a positive development at the moment between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So they have met in Baghdad, in Iraq, in order to talk directly with each other. Of course, it's in an initial stage, and it can't be destroyed from external or internal spoilers. But at the end, they are trying to talk with each other, and this is also one indicator, at least from my perspective, that shows that shows that not every party is interested in a zero-sum game. And there is also kind of an interest when it comes to economic prosperity, when it comes to youth and women empowerment, etc. The challenges are all very similar in all of those countries. So in this regard, we in Europe, in Germany, or also in Canada, we should identify actors that are trying to enhance this regional integrative approach. And I think we have good opportunities here, and the networks have increased. And there are potential partners on every side. So therefore, let's look for the chances and not only for crisis.
That's an incredible point. Very powerful intervention, Sebastian. Thank you very much for it. We're now going to move into a bit of a dialogue between our amazing panelists and their rich and very diverse perspectives and ranges of experience. First, I wanted to turn to Nikolai Mladenov, who I believe has a question for Jonathan Fulton and perhaps Elena Delosher. So Nikolai, over to you.
Thanks, Shuv. Sebastian presented a very important vision for the future, and as I was listening to him, I was thinking, do you think that really Canada, the European Union, the Americans, the West in general, can work together with the Gulf countries in developing a common framework for the security, for the economic development, for the social development, even if it's for the infrastructural development of the Red Sea region, with focus on the Africa side of the Red Sea region? Because it seems that from an outsider's perspective, it may be an opportunity exactly in support of the transitions that we're seeing in some of the African countries there, in terms of also affecting some of the conflicts that have been going on for a very long time, preventing escalation, etc. So maybe it is time for a sort of an international quartet of the West, working together with the GCC, with the UAE, other countries in the Gulf, to put some political thinking and some money into supporting development in that part of the world. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Elena, I'll turn to you both, but in the spirit of the 25 minutes we have left, let me encourage interventions to be about a minute, and so we can get to a bit of the audience questions too. So, Jonathan, over to you first.
Sure. I mean, it's a great point, and I think you're right. The development needs are so substantial that I think everybody's open to a wide range of different actors. You know, like the thing I see, obviously focusing on China, is that the narrative tends to be China's BRI is eating the world in one gulp. But especially in East Africa, you can see a lot of countries. India's involved, Japan is involved, Turkey's getting involved. There's room for Europe, there's room for Canada. I mean, I think the thing that would really be helpful is competition, and that sets standards, and that makes it just creates a much better environment. But in terms of the Africa stuff, I'll leave it to Elena, because she knows it much better than I do.
Thank you, Jonathan. Elena?
Yeah, so this is a critical issue because the kind of investment matters. So there's infrastructure investment, and then there's also FDI, foreign direct investment. And so the US does a ton of foreign direct investment in Africa, always has. I don't know what Canada's numbers are offhand, but that's always been sort of the way of, at least the way of the West, let's say. China, Turkey, UAE, and others are doing a lot more on the infrastructure investment side, which will ultimately help Canadian and American companies, right? Like if the UAE builds a road that can get products, from a port into a capital city, then Coca-Cola can use that road, right? So there's different types of investment. And so I definitely think there can be some more thinking about what sorts of investments would be the best. These are massive consumer markets on the African side. So these are places that American companies, especially consumer-facing companies, want to be a part of. Apple wants to sell their iPhones. Coca-Cola wants to sell Coca-Cola. It may not be as attractive for infrastructure companies. For example, Verizon might not want to build Ethiopia's telecom network because there's different regulations or limitations in the legal structure of the country or something like that. So there might be sort of certain restrictions on other types of companies, but certainly on consumer and tech-facing companies, there's a lot of potential here. As for the comment about working with the Gulf, I think that the US, Europe, Canada, all of the Western countries should for sure be figuring out where their partners in the Gulf and elsewhere can be helpful. But at the same time, we have to be a little bit wary in the sense that we don't have the same objectives all the time. So, the Gulf countries are a little bit more comfortable with leaderships in countries that are a little bit more military strongman, that kind of thing, than we are. So, in a lot of these very fragile places like Somalia, Sudan, et cetera, we want to be cognizant and careful that in other words, we can't turn our policy over to those partners in the region. We have to work with them and figure out kind of where we can agree on how things should go forward. And also, I mean, I think this goes without saying, but we've got to involve the African countries themselves more in our conversations. I mean, we should go to them and say, like, what do you need and want? Where can we find ways that it can be helpful to both of us? And what are you afraid of, or what are you trying to avoid? Because they're not, some of those countries are very happy with Turkey, Russia, China, Gulf, et cetera, and others have concerns. And so we should be aware of those as well.
Oh, thank you very much. I think Jonathan Fulton has a question to pose to Sebastian based on some of his own expertise. So Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, not really a question, just I really liked the point you closed on about the role of youth. I came to the Middle East, as I said in my comments, I wasn't a Middle East guy, I was an Asia guy. And I came here because I wanted to learn about a region that I thought I needed to know more about to be good at foreign policy. But I came here with a lot of baggage. You know, anybody who grew up in the 80s and 90s looked at the Middle East with a lot of, prejudices. Well, I mean, a lot of them were pretty accurate at the time. But I've been working at a university teaching Emirati 20-year-olds every day since 2006. And it's been a really cool gig. And one of the things that impresses me is they don't see the region, in the same way. Like the narratives that people of our generation grew up about the Middle East don't necessarily apply. They're so cosmopolitan. They're so comfortable with, they're really comfortable with people from all over the world. They're comfortable with cuisines and culture and fashion and pop music and whatever. So it really does give me a lot of hope that there are, at least in, in these countries in the GCC where there's a higher level of development and everybody's a little better off, that, they really do see the world in a way that's not really consistent with the way we tend to see Arab youths. And I just thought it was a really good comment you made.
That's wonderful. Appreciate that intervention, because I think I'm going to turn now to Sebastian to respond to you and to pose his own question. So Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you, Shuv. Maybe just one brief comment. So of course, there is a chance for Europe to engage more, but we also need to take into consideration what is the perception of Europe at the moment in the region. And at least from my perspective, it's not the best at the moment, to put it this way. So when I talk to my colleagues in the Gulf and elsewhere, they don't see necessarily the European Union or Europe as a role model anymore, due to the fact that we are suffering from our own problems. We had the Brexit. There is rising Islamophobia, anti-Semitism in Europe. There we have right-wing movements in the eastern part of Europe and elsewhere. So this is also, of course, very carefully watched by our colleagues in the region. So therefore, we first and foremost need to address what can we offer. What is the European business model we can bring to the region, or we can get in contact in the dialogue with them. And at the moment, and that's what I laid out, development cooperation, for instance, offers a successful model that could bring the best of both worlds together. I have two questions. One for Mariam with regards to the Saudi-Iranian talks in Baghdad. I already alluded on quite briefly. So, what is your take on that? Is it only tactical, or is there something behind? What is Iran what wants Iran out of it? Could there be a solution? And that is maybe also to Elena. Could there be a solution also for Yemen? I don't want to mean a solution, but maybe kind of a positive development coming out of those talks. And another question goes to Jonathan with regards to Northern Africa and to the Maghreb. How do you assess the role of China there? And could there be also kind of a competition or more cooperation between China and the Gulf states in this strategic region? Sorry for those questions, for those many questions, but I'm really interested in hearing from you.
You're very curious and you're very engaged, and 3 questions are entirely out of order, but completely appreciated. So why don't we let Miriam respond once in a minute, then we'll turn to you, Elena, and then finally, who was it that you would pose a question to? Forgive me, Sebastian. To Jonathan.
To okay. Jonathan, and just very briefly, the question on Yemen was, could there be any positive outcome for Yemen by the talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia in Iraq at the moment?
Wonderful. Thank you for that clarification on Yemen. So first to Miriam.
You're on mute, Miriam.
My apologies. So talks between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, the content of those talks I see as probably very fluid and changing, and particularly right now. So, or if they are, I imagine that at the beginning they're very surface level and maybe some building of what is going to be on the agenda. I think Saudi Arabia, if Trump had won the US election, and if maximum pressure against the Islamic Republic had continued, and if the Abraham Accords had continued momentum, I think there would have been possibility to see that Saudi Arabia, because there were some indications, could be joining the Abraham Accords. But now Saudi Arabia, seeing that the Biden administration is already appeasing the Islamic Republic, I imagine the Saudis are looking to at least cover their own bases as much as they can. The Israelis are doing the same thing in their own way, indicating that they will take action, military action if needed, and covert sabotage operations, cyber attacks, what have you, on the nuclear program if needed. I think both the Saudis and the Israelis really are thinking to themselves that we might be on our own here, and so how do we want to do this? But I don't see that if Saudis and the Islamic Republic are negotiating at a table, that necessarily changes the other things that they're doing against each other in Yemen, or the not so cold war that exists now between them. So they can continue to talk and have the same dynamics continue. That's just my take.
Thank you very much. And now over to Elena on Yemen. Is there any room for hope?
Gosh, I could talk about Yemen for hours. I'll save you. So I think the Saudis really want out of the conflict. That's been true since they were targeted in 2019, probably by Iran on their Abqaiq facility. There was a real shift as soon as that attack happened in the Saudis' perspective on Yemen. They went from thinking they could have a military victory to overnight wanting a diplomatic solution. The Houthis are aware of that and are sort of taking advantage of that perspective because they know the Saudis want out. And so I think the Saudis talking to the Iranians is a way of trying to really mitigate the part of the Yemen conflict that is most dangerous to them, which is the Houthis sending Iranian supplied missiles into Saudi and as far as Riyadh. So I see it as basically two conflicts. I mean, there's actually about 10 conflicts in Yemen, but let's say two for now. There's the conflict in Yemen, the sort of civil war, and then there's the Houthis sending missiles into Saudi. And I think the Saudis might be able to talk to the Iranians about that bit of it. But that's not going to solve, even if the Iranians said tomorrow, okay, we won't send any more missiles to the Houthis, and that were absolutely true, and that went perfectly, even if that idealistic solution was in place, there would still be the war in Yemen. So the Iranians are a booster for the Houthis, but they're not the source of their power. And the Houthis would still be in control of Yemen, even if Iran pulled out tomorrow. It would limit them in certain ways, of course, but it wouldn't just suddenly magically end the war. So I think Yemen is a situation where you need the political will of the domestic parties, the political will of the Houthis and the Hadi government to end the war, and regional political will, which totally exists on all fronts, and Western political will. Everyone external to Yemen has the political will to end the war, but you need the people inside Yemen to have the political will to end the war, and that's what's really tricky.
That's like asking, Elena is one of the leading experts in the world on Yemen. That is the perfect distillation of issues that I think that are affecting that country. Thank you for making it so concise. Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, she started by saying she could talk about it for hours, and I've heard her talk about it a lot, and I've always gotten a lot out of it. It's a cool thing to do if you're a nerd like me, is just to say, hey, Elena, talk about Yemen. I can do the same thing about China and the Middle East, but it's probably not as fun. The question about the Maghreb and if there's any room for competition between China and the Gulf countries, I don't really think that's the case, because I think it's not a core interest for China by any stretch. It's an area of opportunism. What China's doing in the Maghreb is they're investing in these ports that link to the northern Mediterranean. They're building these Huawei training facilities and data centers and stuff. But it's not really, it's stuff it's picking at the edges of what's available. I think everybody in China is very much aware that the Maghreb is seen as just more naturally linked to Europe, and China doesn't have the influence. The other big consideration, of course, is that China's Belt and Road is dictating a lot of what it's doing in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East. And the Belt and Road is about interconnectivity across countries and regions. And the Maghreb is famously the least integrated region, in Africa, if not in the world. So, what you see playing out in the Gulf, for example, where, these business clusters I mentioned, from Abu Dhabi to Djibouti to Egypt, you don't really find that working the same way in the Maghreb, where, China's projects in Tunisia or in Morocco kind of stand alone, which kind of makes me think that it's probably not going to be as deeply involved there until some of that regional competition gets resolved.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody, for an incredible series of interventions touching across a range of geopolitical, economic, and security pressures in the contemporary Middle East and Red Sea region. Obviously, we have to turn to some audience questions in our remaining minutes here, so we're grateful to our panelists for having their interventions been short and their questions being really incisive. The first question I'd like to take from the audience is to Nikolai Mladenov. And I think I'm going to take a bit of a twist on the question, because it's one about Russia's role in the region. But Nikolai had been, as the special coordinator in the Middle East peace process, focused on attending the Security Council and briefing them very regularly on a range of issues, including each of the P5. Of which Russia is a part. So let me ask the question to you, Nikki. Of course, you only have a minute to answer this, but from your perspective and the experience that you bring to the table, what has Russia's role been in the region at large?
Thanks, Shuv. It really depends on what part of the region you're looking at. Certainly in Syria, it has been one of supporting the Assad regime, and to a certain extent fighting Daesh and whatever is left of it there. On the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it has generally stayed out of any detailed engagement on both sides. Basically, its positions haven't changed visibly, although what we're seeing in the last few days, particularly with this operation in Gaza, Russia is providing space to Israel to continue this operation. And that is part of the reason why a ceasefire is not imminent. We're seeing a increasingly stronger relationship between Russia, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Gulf. In fact, a relationship that is quite interesting because it ventures not only into the economic and into the security field, but it also may have implications for the Horn of Africa and for the Red Sea region, and a very much strengthened relationship with Egypt. So Russia is a player, but the perspective of what and how it plays in the region really varies on which theater of the Middle East you're looking at.
Excellent question. Excellent answer. Thank you for that, Nikolai. Jonathan, I saw you nodding along a little bit because I know you've been watching Russia's presence alongside China's in the region for a very long time. What's your take on Russia's impact and role in the region?
Well, I got to be honest, I've been watching it through one of my colleagues, Dr. Li Chen Sim, who I've collaborated with a lot. She's a great Russia Middle East analyst, and we've worked on a few things together, but she does all the heavy lifting on it, on Russia, for sure. And I definitely recommend her work. She's great. It's been really interesting to watch because for the longest time I was very dismissive of what Russia was doing in the region. I saw it in its involvement in Syria as mostly driven by its own domestic pressures, dealing with political Islamist groups in the South Caucasus or in the Caucasus, or groups that are fighting there, or trying to manipulate energy markets or manage energy markets. But I got to say, in the past couple of years, Russia's really found a lot of soft spots and taken advantage of it. It's become a much bigger actor than I would have foreseen a few years ago. I still don't think. I think it's still dealing from a widespread perception that Russia doesn't really have a positive vision of what it wants the Middle East to be. I think Russia tends to be seen in the region as just taking advantage of, they're using it as a region to try to smack the US around a little bit, working with Iran to try to destabilize America's interests or challenge its alliances in the region. But that might change. It could be that Russia starts to become a more positive, and by positive I mean not just trying to break stuff, but trying to build stuff. But we haven't really, I haven't seen that so much yet.
No, sadly, the evidence on that is quite slim. One more question from the audience, and I know we're all kind of careening toward a 5-minute window here to end. So I'm going to ask this next question to Elena. George asks, what are the strategic and economic implications of China's first overseas base in Djibouti at the nexus of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden? I'm very curious to see how that particular event is shaping how people think about that.
I think Jonathan probably has a better answer on the China part of this, but I would just suggest that China sort of gets the importance of the Red Sea, and part of the reason I think that the Western countries need to pay more attention to the Red Sea as sort of a region in and of itself, even if we don't, as we talked about before with the seams, we don't mark it necessarily as a region on its own. China certainly thinks of it that way, and it is incorporating the Red Sea very much into its One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road initiative. And this is part of the reason that the Western countries need to pay more attention, because everyone else is paying more attention. Like, we're catching up to what everybody else has already been sort of noting. As I mentioned, the kind of emerging markets of the world are really up and coming now. We're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. Before COVID, all the conferences in the Gulf and in East Africa were all multipolar world. It was the language used in all these conference invites, as Jonathan knows. And it's because the rest of the world is seeing that coming. They're saying, wait, we don't just have the US as an option anymore. We now have China and Russia and maybe Turkey with their drones, and maybe, this country with this and that country with that. Like, the US is now becoming an option, not the sort of singular power. And so I think that Canada, the EU, and the UK, the US need to be paying more attention to this. And to be fair, the EU is on top of it. They're very involved in the Red Sea. They have a special envoy, et cetera. So they should get a lot of credit for paying attention to these issues.
Okay, final comments. Jonathan, you have 30 seconds.
Yeah, just one thing. I think what Elena's saying is pretty important. Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, his first international trip every year is to Africa. Just reassuring to African interlocutors that this is a very important set of relations. We saw Anthony Blinken the other week went to the Ukraine and then did a virtual trip to all of Africa, which showed everybody in Africa exactly how important it was. And when John Bolton went to Africa the last time as a national security advisor, he mentioned African countries, I think 3 or 4 times, and he mentioned China something like 20 times. So I think just showing up and playing, for Canada, for Canadian leaders to devote the energy and the diplomatic capital would go a long way. Just bring some flowers and candy and tell them they're pretty,
Show up and play. 30-second kind of wrap-up comments for everybody at this point. Thank you, Jonathan, for kicking that off. I'll turn next to Miriam.
Okay, thank you so much, Shuv. Thanks to everybody for a great, really great eye-opening discussion. I think, in 1 minute, long-term perspective on the Middle East, as much as possible, focus on people-to-people relations. We have a tendency, I think, to focus when we're thinking about the Middle East on militaries and governments and bilateral relations. But we really, in the free world, we have labor unions and universities and feminists and churches and all kinds of civic institutions that can be reaching out to their counterparts in the region. And I think the region is really hungry and wanting that kind of exchange with the rest of the world. And it's a way of bringing the region closer to itself, more peaceful within itself, and more open to investment from the rest of the world.
Thank you very much for that. Elena, you've got 30 seconds.
I would just encourage everybody to just start thinking of the world in a more multipolar way. I actually hate that term, but it's the best way to sort of describe it, that we need to, the rest of the world doesn't see these dividing lines. Like I mentioned, Africa, Middle East, Asia, North America, et cetera. It's just not so simple. And they see especially if you talk to traders, they see maritime waterways as really like the lifeblood of how the world works, as opposed to as dividing lines. It's actually the exact opposite of dividing lines. These are the places where things come together. And so I would just recommend everyone on the call, whether you work in government or private sector or whatever it is that you do, that you just start, although we have to have these sort of bureaucratic lines somewhere to kind of organize ourselves, just make sure that we don't allow those lines as they exist bureaucratically to become sort of lines in our head in thinking about how the world works.
Fantastic concluding comments from you, Elena. Thank you for that. Let me turn now to Sebastian. 30 seconds for you, and then Nikolai.
Thank you very much. And I just want to add what Elena and Mariam just said. I think it's necessary to reach out to new actors, to new representative and new stakeholders we maybe ignored in the past, specifically also in Europe. And we at Capo, we are trying to work on those events to bring people together. And I think that's the only way in order to overcome stereotypes and obstacles, to learn also more from them and to establish a real dialogue.
Thank you. Perfect timing. Nikolai Mladenov, the last word to you.
Thank you, Shuv. I think the West and the people of the region should have a common interest. And that common interest is peace, security, development. And we'd be very well advised to actually look at this region, the Middle East, the North Horn of Africa, and the Red Sea in between, as opportunity to strengthen our relationships with that part of the world and support exactly that, peace, security, and development. Because without that, the problems of the regions are going to spill over and we're going to be affected by them. And we have enough time to prevent that from happening.
Thank you very much. Let me, as we conclude this amazing conversation, thank you to all of our engaging and amazing panelists with their divergent perspectives, fiercely argued, and very honorably interacted with each other. Thank you very much for your expertise, your time, your perspectives. We couldn't have asked for a better series of advisors to help Canadians consider our interests in the Middle East and Red Sea region. Let me also thank our MLI colleagues who are invisible today. This includes, of course, Alison Kerrigan, Jacqueline Beacom, Brett Byers-Lane, who do incredible work day to day to help us produce our events and our panels. And of course, the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, from which we are hosting this first dialogue on the political realignment of the Middle East and Red Sea region. Stay tuned online for our next iterations on Europe as well as the Indo-Pacific regions. We're looking forward to having a great discussion with Canadians and the Canadian strategic community on long-term interests for Canada's foreign policy. And of course, projects like these don't succeed without the support of people like you. So thank you, audience, so much for participating, for engaging. Go on to Macdonald-Laurier.ca and buy Brett a cup of coffee for his time in putting this together. And of course, please everybody in the region and beyond, stay safe, stay healthy, stay prosperous. We look forward to engaging you many, many more times on the road ahead. Thank you so very much for your time today.